G'day and welcome back to another World of Warcraft video. So recently I spoke a little bit about basically why you should consider being a tank, what are the perks and benefits of being a tank, and I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about DPS. So why should you play DPS, what is the DPS experience like, and basically as a DPS, what are kind of the dominant reasons for being a DPS? So, the big thing with DPS, as a function, DPS or damage dealers firstly come in probably the most various types. So like healers, they only come in one of two types. They come like as mitigating healers, they come as, like healers that heal, as in heal health, but generally speaking your role is to heal, and it comes through as many various mechanisms as you can, but ultimately at the end of the day you are healing. Very much so with tanks, there's two primary kind of tank archetypes: the healing tank, which will heal up the damage that's done to them, and then of course you get the like mitigation tank. So the tank that primarily is there to mitigate damage that's done to them. In DPS, yes, all of your role is just to do damage. But because there are so many different classes and playstyles, you get a whole bunch of variation. So you get spellcasters, you get dot or affliction or damage over time spellcasters like warlocks, shadow priests, etc. Then you get kind of burst damage dealers, characters that are going to do high volumes of damage in a short period of time. So that is people like fire mages, that is characters like marksmanship hunters, etc. Then you get controlled DPS, that is characters that will do sustained DPS for the majority of the fight. So being like beastmaster hunters, as well as also characters like not so much warriors, but more characters like shamans, although depending on which shaman you are, you'll probably be a burst of some kind. So yeah, there are probably the most varied types of, I guess damage types or playstyles when it comes to damage dealers. Because the thing is like if you look at burst damage, for example, you get a melee version, a ranged version, a spellcaster version. So it gives you three distinct playing styles on top of that burst playing style. And then very similarly, if you're doing like a sustained DPS or something, then again you get kind of like three distinct archetypes with that. So it is I guess probably the most varied type. So you can be a DPS and have very varying playstyles, which is a lot of fun. So that's probably one of the biggest perks of DPS. So whereas if you're playing DPS and let's say you start with a mage and it's not working out for you, you can switch to a hunter, you can switch to a paladin, you could switch to a rogue, and they'll each have their own distinct playstyles or differences that will potentially allow you to enjoy them. So it's got the most flexibility. Now in terms of everything else, what else about DPS? Well, I would say probably their leveling experience or solo experience is also probably the best. Things like quests, things like mainly questing, things like joining in on random boss fights, things like hunting rares, especially when you start to get somewhat decent gear, tends to be, well, to put it bluntly, a lot easier as a DPS. Tanks, depending on the tank, can just sometimes take a very long time to do stuff, especially in solo questing, and very similarly with healers. Healers can all of a sudden take a very long time to do certain things comparable to other classes, and it can be a not holistically unenjoyable experience, but it can just be not an as fun experience as if you were a DPS. So I would say DPS definitely, in terms of the leveling experience, tend to probably have the, I don't want to say easier ride, because there are definitely some DPS that do not have a good leveling experience, and especially solo. But I would definitely say for the majority of them, as long as you read up on how to play your class, you'll probably have a better time. Just due to the fact that you'll be able to, do damage, clear out mobs, clear out enemies, and do certain things a lot faster than the other classes. So DPS sound pretty cool so far, but what is the big thing? Well, endgame is probably the hardest for them. So as a DPS, to get into like an adequate endgame, so I'm not talking LFR, I'm talking specifically PvE, so we're talking like raiding, Mythic Plus. I find that for DPS, you're in the most competitive sphere. So obviously you have the most players play DPS, so you have the majority of the player base is playing DPS. What that means is that as players, you can struggle because you're now facing a larger player base, which means you're facing a much larger skill set of players, a much wider group of players, and so in theory you are probably in the most competitive sphere of World of Warcraft gaming. So yeah, it definitely is quite tough. Not saying it's impossible, but it's definitely quite tough. I think for a lot of players it's definitely a competitive area of the game. DPS, like to be a top DPS does require you to really know what you're doing, to study the boss fights, and we'll talk about that now because the playstyle for endgame is very competitive. So not only is it competitive to even get into the raids, but if you do not perform, you're also probably the first cut. So like with tanks, there's a bit of a margin for error, not huge. I'm not saying you can just fail all the time, but for tanks, because there's two of them, there's kind of a slight chance for a margin of error. The game kind of has to bake into the fact that you might screw up a rotation or two. And not saying that it's great, but DPS, there are DPS checks, and if you fail a DPS check and you are not hitting an adequate marker in terms of DPS, you're probably going to be cut. So that's kind of the tough part of being a DPS in endgame. Your stability for endgame content is very low if you are not part of a pre-made group. Very few pugs are going to put up with subpar DPS. Your learning curve is very difficult because your access to endgame content is very low. Like you don't have access to endgame content in the sense of like you can't just go practice a whole bunch of hardcore heroics or normals or anything. You need to find a group. You have to already be doing good enough damage already. So it's quite difficult to I guess just get a whole bunch of success. So it's one of those things. I will say, for me, like I find DPS to be way more stressful than tanking. It's why I don't DPS. If you are in a pre-made, it's a lot more fun. You kind of have this small avenue whereby you can, I don't want to say abuse your friends, but people are a lot more understanding. This allows you to learn and get a bit better in terms of things. Your gear is also rather competitive as well. Most people are expecting you to have the best gear, or at least something close to it. And so, yeah, there is a little bit of, I don't want to say difficulty or anything or anxiety, but there's definitely a higher bar that you're competing against just due to the size of the DPS population and in general just the requirements that players expect in terms of performance and just overall ability. But being a DPS is also very rewarding. I do find like you have the natural competitiveness of DPS makes it really fun when you start to get good. And I don't mean that in a sense of like, you need to get good. Well, you kind of do. But the thing is like you are actively competing against other people. You are actively trying to improve. You are actively trying to be a better player. Your direct metric is pretty simple. Am I doing the fight? Am I doing high DPS? Now there are exceptions, of course. You need to stick to mechanics. You need to be able to do certain mechanics or do certain things, of course. Yeah, if the boss fight requires you to juggle certain mechanics, you have to focus on those instead of DPS. And I think that sometimes can be where, I don't want to say where people forget that they're playing an MMO, but it definitely feels like that's probably the only area where DPS kind of forget, or just people in general, forget that aspect of the raid. But yes, your DPS number, your number in terms of your DPS, is most important in terms of your overall performance. It's the easiest way to tell how well you're doing. Is my number high? Am I dominating? Am I not? So yeah, overall, you should definitely try DPS. It's 100% a super fun spec. I love all the specs, I play all the specs. But I think a big thing with DPS that people need to realize is that the end game is unfortunately probably the biggest competitive scene. So if you're looking to become truly a top end game DPS, to do heroics, to do mythic raids, or high level mythic plus, you need to bring your A game. Learn your rotation, put in some effort. Don't just rock up pressing buttons that you think you're supposed to press. Really put in some effort, learn your class, learn your rotations, learn how to spike your DPS, and you'll find that once you get that thrill of hitting high numbers and nuking down bosses and yeah, just being basically a huge menace, you're going to have a great time. But that's it from me. See you guys in the next one. Bye.